The first time I read the Mount Hood file, I read it wrong. I'd been going through retired colleagues' archived material for about 6 months by then, mostly missing persons cases that closed without closing. And I treated Mount Hood the way I was treating the others, as paperwork. 4 hikers, third night out, the search team, 3 survivors, 1 who didn't come back. I made my notes and moved on. I came back to it 8 months later because of a phrase. A friend of mine, retired from the Forest Service east of the Cascades, had been reading something else of mine and stopped to say, they didn't ask the survivors what they were looking at. When I asked her what she meant, she said, "Pull the file again. Look at how they were sitting." So I pulled it. The 3 survivors had been found about 2 miles from camp, sitting at the base of a single hemlock, all 3 of them, backs to the trunk, facing the same direction. I'd read that the first time. What I had not done was ask why 3 people in a cold woods, after some kind of bad night, would face the same way. I want to start here, not because Mount Hood is the strangest case I have, but because of what it taught me about how to read the others. Here's what I have. 4 hikers, ages 26 to 34, friends out of the Portland area, started a 3-day loop on the east slope of Mount Hood on a Friday afternoon in late September. The trail was one they'd done together at least twice before. The forecast was dry, cold at night, nothing unusual. The last message out of their group chat went to a family member at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, the 3rd night. I have a screenshot of it. It reads, "Someone is walking around the tents. 2nd night now, doesn't show himself but walks." Nothing else came out of that camp. Service up there is patchy. The ranger station at the trailhead noted that the message could have been delayed in delivery, but the timestamp on the recipient's phone matched the timestamp in the message body. By dawn Monday, no one could reach any of them. Search and rescue went up Monday afternoon, and they found the camp Tuesday morning at the edge of a small clearing. A tent split top to bottom, with the ranger's note saying it had been opened by hand and not by blade. A fire pit pressed flat into the dirt by something heavy moving across it once. And what one of the rangers wrote up as barefoot impressions, approximately 14 inches in length, stride approximately 6 to 6.5 feet. I've asked that ranger about that line 3 times in 3 different conversations. He won't talk about it on the record. He told me last summer, off the record, that he wrote barefoot because he didn't know what else to call it, and he wrote down the measurement because that's what the tape gave him. Anything past that he wasn't going to put his name to. 3 of the 4 were found alive Tuesday afternoon. The 4th was not. The 3 weren't in the emergency states you might expect. Vitals were within range, no critical hypothermia, nothing close to fatal dehydration. Mostly they were quiet. They had walked, or been walked, from the camp to that hemlock, and they had sat down with their backs against the trunk, and they had been there for what the medical examiner later estimated at 8 to 10 hours. What they said at the hospital is in the file. It's short, and the 3 of them say close to the same thing. It came near to camp 4 nights, not 3. It didn't approach. It stood at the edge of the firelight and stayed there, and then it left, and then the next night it was back. On the 4th night, something else happened, and that part the 3 of them don't describe in the same way and don't describe completely. I'll come back to Mount Hood. There's another piece I need to set down beside it first. The piece I want to set beside Mount Hood is a recording that lasts 18 seconds. Laura Bennett was 31. She kept a blog about solo hiking in Oregon and had built a small following on the strength of being patient. Her video posts weren't exciting. She would film a stretch of trail or the inside of her tent at dusk, or sit and record the sound of the woods at 4 a.m. She had a thing about ambient audio. In one of her posts, she wrote that she liked recording sound Because the camera lied less when there was nothing to look at. I bring that up to make the recording she left behind less surprising than people make it sound. Carrying a satellite communicator and a recording device into a remote campsite was not unusual for her. She'd done it dozens of times. The reason her 911 call from a coastal range trail in late October went through at all is that her overnight spot happened to sit on a small ridge with a working line of sight to a cellular tower in the next valley. She'd used that spot before, and she'd flagged it in her notes as one of the few places in that area where her phone reliably had service. The call is 18 seconds. The dispatcher who took it is now retired and will speak about it on background only. I have a copy of the audio because Laura's brother sent it to me after he read what I'd been writing about Mount Hood. He sent it without a note. The file name was the case number. The recording opens with her breathing.
He's standing. He's too tall. He doesn't leave, he just stands. 33 feet. I'm not moving. I'm not.
The line drops there. She doesn't finish the sentence, and the dispatcher doesn't get a call back in. Search teams reached the campsite on the third day. The site itself was undisturbed in the way the Mount Hood camp was disturbed. Tent intact, gear still inside, cookware in the right bag. Her camera was on the ground next to the tent, lens facing up at the sky. The battery still had charge. The last image on the card was taken about 15 seconds before the 911 call connected. I've looked at that image more times than I want to admit. It shows the trees behind her camp. Between the second and third trunk from the left, at a distance the photo metadata estimates at 22 to 27 yards, there is a vertical shape. The shape isn't lit by anything. It is darker than the trees around it, and it doesn't have features at the resolution available. What it has is height and a posture, by which I mean the upper portion isn't where you'd expect the upper portion of a person to be at that distance. The line my eye wants to draw is wrong. I know what I'm looking at, and I do not know what I'm looking at, and that's exactly the failure I want to flag. Laura wasn't found. The investigation closed under the standard form, no indication of foul play, presumed missing. The blog posts were taken down by her family. I have a folder of them I obtained while they were still up. What I want to flag, the thing I cannot get out of my head, is a phrase that shows up in two of her older posts. She used it twice that I know of, in audio narration over slow shots of trees. She said the woods get quiet when something is in them that the woods don't want there. She said it in February. She said it again in August on the recording she made 3 days before the trip to that ridge. So we have Mount Hood and we have a coastal range ridge. 4 people in one camp who say something stood at the edge of the light for 4 nights running. One person on a recording, alone, 18 seconds, who says he stands and is too tall. The phrase that pulls them together is hers. Quiet. The woods get quiet. I want to talk now about what it means when somebody who has spent serious time in those woods uses the word quiet and means it the way she meant it. Tom Reed's diary is what gives this case its shape. 87 pages. A small green field notebook, held now by the local archive in his county in a folder with 2 other items his son donated after the coroner returned the pack. A topo map with a route Reed had drawn and revised over years, and a small tin of waterproof matches he had not opened. I've read the diary front to back 4 times. The last 12 pages, more times than I have counted. Reed hunted for 40 years on the east side of the Cascades. He spent his last 15 seasons going out alone after his usual partner had a heart attack. His son told me, on the phone, that the year Tom stopped taking a partner was also the year he stopped talking about his trips when he came back. He came home, hung the rifle, went to bed. There was nothing bad to report and nothing good to report, and so he stopped reporting. The diary follows a hunter's pattern for the first 3/4 of its pages: wind direction, the drainage he was working that day, distances, numbers of shots fired and reasoned about. He had a habit of underlining a single word per page, almost always a weather word: wet, still, thaw. It is, in those early pages, the work of a man who knows where he is, and has known where he is for a long time. On the page he labels day 5 of his last trip. A trip he'd told his son would be 6 days. The entries change. The first change is small. He writes that he stopped to dress a deer and heard footsteps behind him, and that when he went still to listen, the footsteps went still as well. He notes this without underlining anything. The next entry, later the same evening, says he heard them again on the way back to camp, and that they were not passing him. They were stopping when he stopped. He writes one line at the bottom of that page: "Not following an animal trail, following me." The handwriting on day 6 is smaller. He has switched from his usual block letters to a tighter cursive that doesn't look hurried so much as tired. He writes that he sat at his fire for 2 hours without writing anything, and then made the entry that takes up the entire page. The phrase from that page is the one his son knew before I did, because the local paper got hold of it after the diary was donated. Moves when I don't look, stands when I look. He underlines neither word. He writes it once and lets the rest of the page be blank. The last entries are short, and not because he was rushed. There was less to say. He stops describing the country and describes only what he is hearing without seeing, and he describes it the way an experienced witness would. He gives distances and durations. He notes the wind because the wind matters. On the second to last page, in handwriting that has gone back to block letters pressed harder into the paper, he writes, "Not animal. Animal doesn't do this." The sentence sits alone on the page. The last page has 3 words and a date. The date is correct. The words are, "It is closer." The pack was found about 33 yards from a campsite Reed had used in previous years and had marked on his map with the year of each visit. The fire was cold. The rifle was leaning against a hemlock, loaded, safety off, round chambered. Reed's knife was in the pack. The knife was bent 90 degrees at the base of the blade where it meets the handle, in the way a piece of metal bends when something is applied force to it that the metal was not designed to refuse. I want to be careful about how I read that knife. A bent knife in a pack is worth less than people think. He could have stepped on it. He could have sat on the pack. I noted that for myself when I first looked at the photograph. Then I looked again. The way the steel is folded back is not the way a man bends a knife by stepping on it. The geometry is wrong, and the pressure has come from one direction, not from above. Reed's body wasn't recovered. The file stayed open for the standard interval and was closed. The line that pulls Reed to Laura Bennett and to Mount Hood isn't a line about footprints or wind or the woods getting quiet, though all 3 are in here. It is a line about looking. Reed wrote that it stood when he looked. The Mount Hood survivors were placed under one tree facing one direction. Laura Bennett's recording has her saying, very softly, that he isn't moving and that she isn't moving. There's a kind of standoff being described in 3 different voices by people who didn't know each other and weren't in the same county. Harold Finch had 32 years in the Forest Service. He worked a remote sector in the Willamette and was 3 months from his planned retirement when his radio went out. The morning check-in on his last day was normal. The midday check-in was missed. He came back on the air on his own at 4:40 p.m. I have a copy of that transmission. The dispatcher is a woman who is still working. She wouldn't let me record her, but she sat across from me at a kitchen table and walked me through the tape, line by line. Finch's voice on it is level. The thing she pointed out twice was that he was talking slower than usual. Not slurred, not anything she would have flagged in a routine review. A small adjustment in pace, the kind that happens when somebody is thinking about the words while saying them. He told dispatch he had come across what he called structures. He used that word and then corrected himself and said constructions. She wrote both down on the log and circled the second one. He described what he was looking at. The description is on the log in his words and in hers. Trees laid against each other in crosses and triangles stacked higher than a man's head. No saw marks anywhere on the wood. He said this clearly, and then he said, more quietly, that there were a lot of them. He asked dispatch to confirm his coordinates. Dispatch read them back. Finch said, "These are recent, and there are more than one." The next transmission came 20 minutes later. The dispatcher told me she sat through that 20 minutes the way you sit through a phone call from a relative you suspect is in trouble. She didn't call him back because his protocol on that sector was that he initiated. When the radio opened again, his voice wasn't on it. What came through was breathing and footfalls on wet ground, slow, even. The audio runs about 4.5 minutes. There's no speech on it. The recording ends because the battery in his unit died, not because he switched it off. Search teams reached his last confirmed coordinates the next morning. They found the structures. The official report says, wooden formations of indeterminate origin. And a photographer on the team took 38 pictures, of which I have 9. The pictures show trees on the order of 20 to 33 feet in length, smaller trunks than the standing forest around them, fitted against each other in geometries that don't match anything I've seen in survival training, in firefighting clearance work, or in anything an animal does. There's no rope holding any of it together, no nails, and no cut surfaces visible on any of the wood. The pieces are paired by mass and angled in a way that holds without holding itself together by any joint I can identify. I had a forester I trust look at 4 of the photographs without telling him where they came from. He said one word, then thought about it for a minute and added a sentence. The word was no. The sentence was, "Nothing in those pictures is doing what wood does." Finch wasn't found. The sector was closed under the language, "for reasons of operational safety," and remains closed. I want to be honest about my hesitation here. The Reed diary, the Bennett recording, the Mount Hood survivors are all testimony, and testimony bends. I've spent a working career watching it bend. The Finch case is different because the structures are still there. They're photographed, they're measured, they sit at a coordinate. Whatever you decide they are something that someone or something put together, and they are heavier than a person can fairly account for. That's the line where I started to think I wasn't building a folder of strange stories. I was building a folder of strange evidence. Eric Miller is alive and lives in Eugene with his sister. I haven't interviewed him. His sister was clear about that. She wrote me a polite, short email saying that he reads what I send, that he asked her to pass on a line, and that he doesn't want to talk on the phone, in person, or on a recording device. The line he asked her to pass on was, "Tell him I read the Reed pages. He had it right." I haven't pushed her past that. I included Miller because the official record has more in it than people realize. and because the line he asked his sister to pass on is, by itself, a piece of testimony. Miller went out on a single day's hike on a riverbank in the foothills west of the Cascades in early November. He didn't plan an overnight. He had a day pack, a sandwich, a thermos, and a topo map. His sister filed a missing persons report the next morning when he didn't come home. He was found on day 4, sitting on the shoulder of a logging road about 6 miles laterally from his planned exit point. He wasn't in the wrong drainage by accident. He was on a service road that didn't connect to his trail. He was sitting upright, facing the trees on the far side of the road. He didn't turn when the sheriff's deputy pulled up alongside him. The deputy walked right up to him before he registered the presence and looked at the man's face. The deputy works in private security in Bend now. He wouldn't let me record. The thing he remembered when I asked him what stayed with him was that Miller wasn't cold. Same layers he had left home in. Skin at outdoor temperature, no warmer. In the hospital, Miller was silent for 2 days. He ate when meals came. He sat by his window. The room he was in faced a parking lot and a strip of conifers behind it, and he sat facing the conifers. On day 3, he answered questions in a normal voice. Name, date, where he lived, who his sister was. When asked what had happened in the woods, he gave the answer that everyone who has read this case has read, because it's in the deputy's intake notes and was repeated by a hospital social worker. He said he'd become lost by the evening of his first day. He said that sometime after that, he realized somebody was walking with him. Not behind him, not ahead of him, but level with him, on the parallel. He said the distance was about 22 yards and stayed at 22 yards. It walked with him through the rest of that night, through the next day, and into the night after, neither closing the distance nor falling back. The intake notes have a question and an answer at the bottom. The question is, why did you not try to run? The answer is one sentence. When something like that walks beside you and doesn't come in, running is the wrong call. He hasn't raised the subject again. His sister told me in her email that he no longer leaves the city and that he no longer keeps anything wooden in his apartment. No frames on the walls, no raw boards in his storage closet. The bedroom has metal furniture. When she asked him about it, he said only, "It's not about the wood. It's about what comes near wood." What comes near wood. That's the part I want to put pressure on. Reed wrote it from inside the woods. Miller is saying it from his sister's spare bedroom in Eugene, in a room with metal furniture and no wood in it. The two brothers went out for deer in a sector of the Cascades that takes a full day's walk in from the closest gate. Their truck was at the gate on the date they had paid for the permit. The gate was not locked behind them, which a friend of theirs told me means they intended to come out the same way. 2 men in their 30s, 4 years apart, both experienced. I'm not going to use their names. The family asked me, through a cousin, to keep them out of anything written publicly while their mother is alive. The party that went in after them got there on day 3. The camp was set up the way a careful camp is set up. Tent zipped, food in the hang, cookware clean and stacked. The thing the search lead noticed first, and the thing he made me write down twice when I sat with him, was that the sleeping bags were still rolled. They hadn't gotten to that part of the night. There was no fire. The ash in the pit was older than their stay. Whatever they had eaten that evening, they had eaten it cold. The rifles were the part the search lead remembered most clearly, because they were on opposite sides of the fire pit, laid down rather than dropped, and because both barrels were curved. I have looked at the photographs. The curve is consistent on the two weapons. The shape on each is a single arc, receiver to muzzle, in the same direction on both rifles. The chambers were empty. There were no spent casings within 55 yards of the camp. The bolts were closed. I want to put that next to Reed's knife. I'm not claiming the same force did both. I'm saying that I have a knife folded 90 degrees at one specific point, in one direction, with no pry marks. And I have two rifles whose barrels have been arced in one direction, in matching geometry, in a camp where no one had time to start a fire. The brothers weren't found in any radius the sheriff put a team on. The case is open in the way these are kept open. It hasn't had a new entry in 3 years. Thank you for watching until the end. It truly means a lot to me. This story was created in silence, frame by frame. Manual editing takes a lot of time. I spent several days putting it together, carefully crafting each scene so you wouldn't just hear it, but feel it and see it. I hope I was able to convey that. And remember, everything you saw is fictional, created purely for entertainment purposes. Any real locations mentioned are used only to enhance the atmosphere and tension. If something resonated with you, feel free to share it in the comments. I read everything. Likes and shares help make the next stories possible. See you soon.